It's a Star Wars show. Welcome. My name is Jon Justice. Glad you're with another episode this week. As always, if you want to email TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or if you're enjoying this up on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and leave me a comment there, and we'll share those comments on next week's episode. This week, we got a brand new Andor Season 2 teaser and behind the scenes talking about a major canon event that we may finally see in live action. Anthony Daniels, C-3PO, talks about the film that he enjoys the most in the franchise and which film he enjoyed shooting the most. Also, the original trilogy, unaltered, showed up on a streaming service over the course of the past week or so, got the fans buzzing about it. I'll talk a little bit about where it was found, the speculation of why it ended up there, and also the fans' obsession. Or I should say a certain segment of the fandom. The obsession that fans have with the unaltered original versions of the films, that original trilogy. I'm not one of those, but we'll get into that a little bit later on in the episode. Glad you're with a Star Wars show this week.
Will you have a spark that'll light the fire that'll burn the First Order down?
From Gizmodo, Lucasfilm dropped a special behind-the-scenes teaser featurette. Gives us a better glimpse at the Andor Season 2, revealing some familiar ships and a few more intriguing hints at what Insurgents and Imperials alike are going to be up to in the Star Wars streaming show, seeming to also confirm a fundamental moment in the creation of the Rebel Alliance. As I mentioned on last week's show, I'm really excited for Andor in a way that I did not expect to be. Been going through a rewatch of Season 1 and really enjoying it more so than I did the first few times I watched it. The only part of Andor Season 1 that I never really got into was all of the sequences taking place in the prison. I just didn't find those sequences, while they're pivotal to the storytelling, I just didn't find that story element and that storyline, I didn't find that very compelling. But I am very much, I think more so, looking forward to Season 2, just given the fact that this runs up right to the beginning of Rogue One. The 3-minute featurette, released first on Disney+, teasing the setup for Season 2, which will take place across the 4 years between the climax of Andor Season 1 all the way up to the leading days to Cassian's mission on Kafrene that opened up Rogue One, a Star Wars story. It's also filled with a lot of new shots from the second season, building on what we saw in the most recent trailer. And this includes Cassian's theft of a TIE Avenger, which we originally saw hinted at and talked about in the Rebels animated series, Vel training insurgents, some intriguing shots of Mon Mothma's often discussed, barely seen homeworld of Chandrila as well. Now, Rogue One fans will be particularly pleased to see the return of the U-Wing. I know that I was. Seen in several shots around the Alliance base on Yavin 4. A few more glimpses of Saw Gerrera's partisans, as well as fleeting looks at Ben Mendelsohn and Alan Tudyk returning as K2SO, Orson Krennic and obviously K2SO respectively. But perhaps the most intriguing of all of this confirmation is that Season 2 will be taking fans to a very familiar world. This would be Gorman. Several shots we'd already seen of large crowds protesting Imperial forces in a port city and the ensuing disaster that comes when the Imperials start firing on those crowds. This feature was closed captioned. It identifies the protesters as singing in Gore. Now, originally in canon, I believe that Gorman was supposed to be a planet that was comprised of an alien species, wherein they've made some changes now. Well, I should say in the storytelling, not canon. Now it will be canon storytelling that this is a human species on Gorman. Gorman is a small world along a vital trade route between the core worlds and the Inner Rim. It's the site of a devastating massacre in both the expanded universe, as I mentioned, and some contemporary iterations of Star Wars canon, where swaths of local protesters are slaughtered by Imperial forces. The Gorman Massacre, the prelude to which was already teased in Andor's first season, during Mon Mothma's storyline, where she protests blockades of supply lines in the world in the Imperial Senate, is an atrocity because that becomes a rallying cry for rebel activity across the galaxy that eventually establishes support for the more formal organization of the Alliance to restore the Republic. But it's also especially vital to modern Star Wars canon, as the inciting incident that sees Mon Mothma formally resign from the Senate, labeling herself as a traitor to the state in a speech railing against Palpatine's tyranny. We see the direct fallout of the massacre in Rebels' third season. This is the season wherein the Ghost crew is tasked with escorting Mon Mothma from her fleeing of Coruscant to the planet Dantooine, where she delivers an address to the galaxy calling for the insurgent cells to unite into a formal rebel alliance. And now we know for sure that Andor is going to show us the horrors that preceded that act of defiance, as was shown in clips from both this teaser that I'm talking about right now and the teaser that came out the previous week. So our Andor will debut on April 22nd. That's a Tuesday. It's a 3-episode premiere, as I've talked about. The remaining 9 episodes will drop in 3-episode chapters on a weekly basis thereafter. And I don't know how I'm going to watch this yet, because as I said last week, doing the math based off of the runtime of the first season, to get a movie in every week on a Tuesday is going to be a little bit difficult as we align all of our schedules here in our household. But again, it's Star Wars. We'll figure out a way. I wish they were dropping this on a Friday. It certainly would make my life easier. But then again, they're not putting these out just to fit my schedule. So we'll see how this shakes out. Unless these episodes end up being shorter than what we got in Season 1. But based off of the budget and what we've seen already of the quality of Season 2, based off the footage we've seen, I'm expecting that, much like Season 1, the longest episode was 58 minutes, and I think the shortest was like 38. Also including the credits as well.
Something inside me has always been there. But now it's awake. And I need help.
Anthony Daniels is the only actor to appear in every theatrical Star Wars film. Now, C-3PO was absent from a 2018 film, Solo: A Star Wars Story. Daniels participated anyways. He played a prisoner named Tak in that film, so he's been in every single one of the movies. So which one of these films was Daniels' favorite? Speaking to a crowd at Fan X Salt Lake Pop Culture and Comic Convention, the actor reminisced about his time with the franchise, saying, and doing that thing with my fingers, my favorite was actually Episode 4, the very first film. The reason for that is it was a very simple story. You had Luke, who was the hero who comes from nothing, meets people along the way, a classic journey. And then you have a bad person called Darth Vader. At that time, we don't know it's his daddy, and so I understood it. However, his favorite movie to film was an unexpected choice, according to the Popverse article that I'm referencing. My favorite film to make was the last one, The Rise of Skywalker. I had such fun with the new cast, particularly Oscar Isaac, truly one of the best actors to be in a Star Wars movie. And he had such a bad relationship with 3PO that he persecuted him on an hourly basis, even worse than Han Solo. I was just giggling inside the costume as Oscar annoyed me. The film didn't work out like I thought it might, but nevertheless, it's part of the saga, so you're stuck with it. The article wraps up saying, love it or hate it, if The Rise of Skywalker gave Anthony Daniels happy memories, it can't be that bad. So, I was sent a really interesting email from friend of the show, Shlomo, and I hope you're doing well. I'm going to save this to talk about on next week's show. It is a letter written from a fan email blast, essentially. It was written by Nancy and Tracy Duncan. It was these two women in Europe who had created essentially a fanzine of the time going back to the original Star Wars film. It was called Against the Sith. And what I have here is a letter that they wrote to their readers about how they would be discontinuing their fanzine because of The Empire Strikes Back and why they didn't enjoy The Empire Strikes Back. And again, I'm going to save it for next week's episode because I have a couple other things planned to go along with it. I bring it up as a tease for next week, but also just to talk briefly about the Rise of Skywalker and the negativity around it. It's really interesting to me because that negativity in the fandom has been around since the very beginning. It's not the first time, going back to this 1981 letter from this fanzine, where I have seen publications complaining about The Empire Strikes Back in the original trilogy, and Return of the Jedi included. Of course, the big difference in all of this was that we didn't have social networking to spread negativity. It was kind of locked into very smaller fandoms. I mean, if you followed fanzines like Against the Sith or other fanzines that existed, you may have, exchanged thoughts and frustrations about the films much in the same way that people do now, but it wasn't amplified the way it is now. It raises an interesting question. If you remove the social media element and the negativity within the fandom, if the sequel trilogy would have been better received. Of course, the same thing happened with the prequel trilogy, and it's now looked upon much more fondly than it was when it was initially released. I laugh because I remember when Attack of the Clones came out, and there was negativity to the Phantom Menace, and yet most everybody the consensus was that Attack of the Clones was a superior film and a step in the right direction for the prequels, and now Attack of the Clones seems to be the one that usually lands on the lowest down the lowest on most people's favorite Star Wars films lists. I love that film. And I'm convinced that time will look fondly back on The Rise of Skywalker. I think The Last Jedi, it'll be the same, but The Last Jedi will always have a negative attachment to it regardless of time because of how controversial that film was. But again, I'll get into this letter. It's really, really interesting. I'll dive into this on next week's episode. So be sure that you subscribe to wherever you're listening to this podcast or hit the alarm bell and subscribe to my channel up on YouTube so you don't miss it.
This is not going to go the way you think.
So, speaking of not going the way that you think, for a brief moment, the original version of Star Wars was actually streaming online. So I got this article from Gizmodo. No subtitle, no CG characters in Mos Eisley. Han shoots first. Those things and more were all back this past weekend as the original unedited, unaltered version of George Lucas and his 1977 Star Wars film was available on the Roku app on Cinema Box. Now, the app is no longer available on Roku, and with it went Star Wars as well. Now, for those of you that may not know, during the 20th anniversary of Star Wars, George Lucas released, of course, the special editions. New versions of the films with a bunch of changes that he deemed preferable to the original. And so the special editions became the only versions Lucasfilm would release officially. When you watch the movies on TV, Disney Plus, or maybe even in a theater, they're special editions. The one exception was the 2026 DVD release that actually included the originals as special features. Now that, according to Screen Rant, was the version that was uploaded to Roku's Cinema Box this past weekend. However, Men's Journal noticed that by March 4th, not only was the original Star Wars gone, but the app Cinema Box was gone completely. IO9 reached out to Lucasfilm for possible comment or clarification, but they didn't hear back at the time of when I pulled this article. Now, nevertheless, even if you missed this entire ordeal, it makes you appreciate a few things the article goes on to say. One, how fast the powers can react to something like this. And two, that while Lucasfilm and Disney may want to shove the special editions down our throats, I'll talk more about that sort of language in a moment, there is still a large audience hungry for the versions that they saw growing up, the ones that they watched with their family on Channel 9 on a Sunday afternoon. The ones that we wore VHS tapes out on. And heck, most people are even okay with the original minor altercations Lucas made, like calling the first film Episode 4. It's the bigger stuff that people have a hard time with. Greedo, Jedi Rocks, the Andor celebration, that still to this day feel a little off, according to the article writer. Now, the Greedo, all the changes made in the cantina scene from the original. And then Jedi Rocks would be the replacement of the song in Return of the Jedi in Jabba's palace. The article wraps up like this, and yet we've argued on this very website, if not for the special editions being released in the theaters, Star Wars may have had a very different fate. At a time when the franchise was thought to be done, it was the success of the special editions in 97 that gave Lucas the nudge he needed to make the prequels, which brought Star Wars back to prominence. That later led to Disney's purchase and everything that we have today. So, as much as these special editions can be dismissed by a portion of the fandom, they do serve a purpose. We just wish they weren't the only version we had of a galaxy far, far away. So, first off, the whole complaint over not having access to the original versions is kind of irrelevant at this point in time. Anybody who wants to get their hands on the original versions and even Blu-ray quality versions of the unaltered original trilogy can easily do so by spending all of 5 minutes online, going to any number of websites where what are called the despecialized versions are available for anybody who wants them. Fans have gone and taken the newly released versions, older versions, upscaled them, cleaned them up, and created completely 1080p quality versions of the original trilogy unaltered. There are some fans out there that want them in their purest forms. They want the original prints scanned, upscaled, and put out. It's essentially what you can already get and what fans have already done, but there are those out there that are purists and want it coming from the original source. I mean, right on down to the lack of the episode title in the crawl of the original film. When they originally came out, the episode title wasn't there. That was added much later on. I've gone back online on YouTube, and I've watched despecialized clips of the film, specifically focusing on those places where George Lucas made those changes. And listen, there are times where the CGI isn't great. I almost wish that they would go back and upgrade it even further when they arrive at Mos Eisley. You know, the CGI is a little bit dated, although the way the CGI has been getting worse over the course of the past few years, and I'm convinced it's simply because of hiring policies where we don't have the best and brightest anymore. We're checking off boxes relating to who ends up getting a job. At least that was the case, and hopefully that's changing. That being said, though, I've never been a part of the fandom that was clamoring to see those original versions. When I went back and watched the unaltered portions of those films, yeah, it brought back a little bit of nostalgia for me as a fan, but I much prefer George Lucas's updated vision of what he wanted to do, and I actually respect what he was trying to do. You know, George said, and he was up front, listen, I was limited back in the day over what I, could do via special effects, and with emerging CGI technology, he was able to go in his mind, complete what he wanted to create. And of course, we know what he did with the prequel trilogy, which has, as the article said, brought about everything else. But I always respected that from George Lucas. And I also respect the arguments from the fans who saw those original films, who owned them and watched them on TV, that prefer those over the others, and even argue that the limitations George had in terms of the technology of the day is what made those films special. You hear that same argument made time and time again relating to Jaws and the fact that the shark didn't work. And because the shark didn't work, it was a less is more approach, which added an air of foreboding to that story that made Jaws great. If they were to update Jaws today with a CGI shark, it would take the fun out of that film and wouldn't make it as great as it is. Star Wars doesn't apply quite as one-to-one in that comparison, simply because it was based off of special effects, and specifically when I watched the Death Star battle of the original version using the models, it's cool. to go and look at what they did with model versions and seeing the physical versions in the despecialized editions. That being said, I much prefer the Death Star battle of the special edition and what they were able to do with it. It is still hands down my favorite space battle and probably my favorite sequence of all of the films combined. In my small list of complaints that I have for the sequel trilogy, one of them would be that we never really got a good, proper battle the same way that we did in the original trilogy. I think the opening battle for The Last Jedi is probably the closest one-to-one comparison I can give you. The battle on Geonosis is fantastic, but in The Rise of Skywalker, that's my biggest complaint of that film, is that you had an opportunity at the end with the Battle of Exegol to really execute this amazing space battle and what they were doing with the thousands of Star Destroyers over the planet. And I just feel like they squandered it with a lot of quick, tight, close shots and didn't give us sort of the pull back a little bit view of what we saw in the space battle of A New Hope. I have a similar complaint when it comes to the space battle in Return of the Jedi. I think there's some amazing sequences in that battle, but even then, none of them were able to duplicate what took place and how that original battle and the CGI special edition version in a New Hope over the Death Star was. And I'll make a correction, actually. Let me back up a little bit. Probably the best space battle next to the Death Star one is the battle that takes place over Scarif in Rogue One. That one is probably the closest comparison, where they really took time to widen out the shots, establish the dogfighting sequences so you got a sense of stories within every battle. That's what I loved about the Death Star battle, was that we had all these little tiny stories playing out between the dogfights that were taking place, and it took its time even among this kinetic energy that was unfolding. Still fantastic. I mean, I go back and just watch the Death Star battle all the time when I've got like 10 minutes to kill and I just want to wipe out a bit on Star Wars. Listen, that wraps the show up for this week. As always, I want to hear from you. No email this week. You guys were quiet. It's okay. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, or leave a comment up on YouTube. And before I let you go, you enjoy science fiction. If you like reading or listening to science fiction, I hope you'll check out my EMBARK science fiction space opera series. 7 books in all, completes the entire story. Book 1 tells the story about how deep inside D-Corp, the planet's largest civilian and military spacecraft factory, an industrial accident has set off a catastrophic chain of events. As D-Corp's ruthless leader attempts to exploit the chaos and seize control, the ragtag crew of the Anniversary discovers a mysterious device of unimaginable power. Now, it may fall to a stargazer, a brilliant pilot, a battle-hardened soldier, a tech geek, and a ship whisperer to save Earth's evacuees from annihilation if they can survive the apocalypse first. Do not miss out on this fun, fast-paced, and action-packed epic science fiction adventure without an agenda. Treat yourself, a friend, or a family member with sci-fi. I wrote these stories for adults, but they're great for ages 11 and older. Pick up EMBARK Book 1 today. It's available in hardcover, paperback, audiobook, ebook, and free on Kindle Unlimited. If you like your science fiction space opera to be epic, filled with amazing technology, unique battle sequences, romance, and a lot of action, EMBARK is perfect for you. Head on over to Amazon.com and search for EMBARK, E-M-B-A-R-K, and Jon, J-O-N Justice. Until next week, I hope wherever you are, you're happy, you're healthy, you're safe. God bless, and I'll talk to you then. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My nerd world.